Thank you, Mr. Garion. Thank you, diplomats, representatives of international organizations. I'm not particularly proud I was able to draw this crowd because I'm drawing this crowd for all the wrong reasons. If it was only about good news and all that, that would have been better. But anyway, the gist, the focus of my presentation is going to be around the need to avoid a deterioration of the situation in my part of the country, and for the international community to do everything within its power to make sure that this situation is arrested, and of course peace and stability is maintained, and the Pretoria Agreement, and of course its full implementation is guaranteed. So it's my hope and expectation that the brief explanation I gave would, as Minister Gideon has pointed out, be informative, and at the same time it will give you an opportunity to calibrate the kinds of support you would give the people of Tigray, so that whatever deteriorating security situation there is not going to lead to a complete breakdown of law and order. Of course, it doesn't lead to the kind of war that has caused the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives. And I would rather focus on what the situation on the ground is, and the kinds of factors that are leading to this breakdown of law and order, because the interim administration obviously has reached a point where it cannot conduct its daily business in Tigray, and of course it is drawing more and more external actors in the process, and this is probably a very toxic mix with a breakdown of law and order in Tigray, and the possibility of people who have an axe to grind with either the federal government or even with the people in Tigray coming to the mix. That becomes even more difficult to handle. So I will walk you through some of the recent developments that have become really concerning. Since the establishment of the interim administration, the party to the Pretoria Agreement, the parties to the Pretoria Agreement, TPLF and the federal government, took it upon themselves to set up an interim administration. Well, as you probably know, it took a few months of wrangling for the interim administration to be set up. Obviously, the ruling party, TPLF, had its own internal problems, and this led to continued squabbling among the leadership. But at some point, the leadership was not able to address its internal problems, and it led to a splinter of the very organization. The faction that obviously decided to conduct its own Congress, despite opposition from the Federal Electoral Board, decided that it was the only entity entitled to determine the nature and the composition of the interim administration, without, of course, the consultation with the federal government. This led to a takeover of various zones and various localities in Tigray by this group, denying the interim administration access to significant parts of Tigray. And of course, our hope and expectation was for the interim administration to conduct its business in a matter of a year and a half. But despite the best of our efforts, or the best of the efforts of people who were really focused on discharging their responsibilities as per the Pretoria Agreement, the kinds of impediments that were being put by this faction of the TPLF made it almost impossible for the interim administration to conduct its business. Of late, you see, as part of the Pretoria Agreement, we have embarked on disarmament and demobilization and reintegration process. It was a success, quite a success when we launched it, but there have been setbacks here and there. Unfortunately, some members within the TDF, some members within the TDF leadership decided to recognize that faction, the faction that has conducted Congress as the only legitimate authority in Tigray. And obviously, such a decision flies full in the face of the Pretoria Agreement, because the interim administration's composition or structure or even continuity can only be maintained in consultation with the federal government. So, although we have different views with regard to which faction is legitimate or illegitimate, the fact that this particular faction obviously was given some sort of blessing by some members of the TDF leadership simply means that their action toward dismantling interim administration structures was given a military support. So it introduced another disturbing element in the efforts of the faction, the TPLF faction, simply because members of the Tigray forces were being used to dismantle structures, to remove interim government officials, and to install officials which are appointed by this particular faction, which, as far as we're concerned and as far as the federal government is concerned, has not been recognized by the National Electoral Board itself. So this created a confusion, not only a confusion, this was done as part of the campaign to maybe arm twist the federal government into making concessions. That's for the federal government to decide, but the fact that it made it difficult for the interim administration to carry out its activities, especially the most important activities such as the return of IDPs and other important components of the Pretoria Agreement simply meant that chaos had to ensue. And of course, we have reached a point now where, apart from northwestern Tigray and central Tigray, which have long been taken over by this faction of the TPLF, now we have reached a point where even administrations in the capital, Magala, are being forcibly seized by this faction. Appointees by the interim administration are being rounded up. In many cases, protesters are being fired at. In almost every part of Tigray, there is a roundup of people who are said to be not only sympathizers, not only appointees, but also sympathizers of the interim administrations. Now, it's one thing for a faction to claim that it is entitled to take over power, but it's entirely different to do it in such a way that the very agreement that brought it into the picture, which is the Pretoria Agreement, is threatened. Now, the process of the implementation of Pretoria itself has been lackluster at best. The return of IDPs, especially Western Tigray, has not been. We have barely scratched the surface as far as the return of IDPs. We have made efforts to return IDPs in southern Tigray and northwestern part of Tigray. We still have a long way to go before we can say that the security situation even there is conducive enough for people to feel comfortable. But even where we have made modest progress, the situation on the ground simply means that they have little access to humanitarian aid, they have little access to the kinds of amenities people who have returned to their homes are entitled to. It's very unfortunate. The case of Western Tigray, although we have been working with the federal government to expedite that process, yes, we have been putting the blame squarely on the federal government for a year and so, but I have to admit at this point in time that the last 8 or 9 months, it would be very unfair for me to continue to blame the federal government because the ball was in our court, and because of the political squabbling, because of the kind of confusion that has characterized the situation on the ground in Tigray, we're not able to discharge our part of the responsibility the last 8 or 9 months. We still insist that the source of the most important source of the confusion in Tigray and in the politics in Tigray is our failure to return IDPs. We have hundreds of thousands of people living in very squalid conditions, and everyone wants to take advantage of the fact that they have not been returned to blame, to apportion blame against each other. So the faction of the TPLF would blame the interim administration for having failed or having being a sellout to the federal government, whatever that means. And yet, it often, through practice, stands in the way of a possible return of IDPs, despite our best of efforts to coordinate with the federal government. Obviously, we have been missing in action almost for 8-9 months now. Another complicating factor here, of course, the question of DDR. We're supposed to resume DDR yesterday, and the security situation on the ground, I have been told, has made it almost impossible for the resumption of the DDR process, which has been stalled for quite some time now. The DDR is quite critical because tens of thousands of combatants really need it. And of course, the readiness on the part of members of the TDF to go through this process of DDR has been quite significant. But I have to admit that the leadership, myself included, were not particularly forthcoming when it comes to the expeditious implementation of the DDR process. Although the Rehabilitation Commission has rightly declined to go ahead with the process because of the situation on the ground, it's my hope and expectation that with the right mix of support by the international community, by the federal government, and some sort of semblance of stability in Tigray, we'll be able to resume it because it's going to be very critical. Tigray cannot afford more than 200,000 combatants sitting in camps, of course, living off what little is left of the federal block grant the federal government makes available for Tigray, which is not much as far as I'm concerned. So it has been a very difficult thing to carry out, not because there was no willingness on the part of the combatants, or even here, although I have written a letter blaming the federal government for standing in the way of the process, I have to admit that maybe that was a bit of a stretch because as far as we're concerned, there was also failure on our part, and we should also take part of the blame. In fact, the most important portion of the problem, especially at this point in time. This crisis, political crisis in Tigray, also means that with the support of some officers, high-ranking officers I'm not saying this is shared by every TDF higher officers. There are some who, for one reason or another, assume that the best option for Tigray is to continue to support one faction of TPLF. And that faction of TPLF has also members, senior members, who feel that it is very difficult to trust the federal government. So naturally, they are inclined to find greener pastures elsewhere. And unfortunately, those greener pastures are not quite reassuring as far as the stability of Tigray is concerned. So there are some who reach out, for example, to our friends, the other side of Marab, the Eritreans, assuming that some sort of collusion with them would give them a much better bargaining position, or better still, a cloud, not only a cloud, but also a leverage against the federal government. This is not shared by every member of the leadership, both political and military, but so few influential members of the military top brass and the political leadership entertain such illusions. And of course, that means those who feel that they have an axe to grind against the federal government, or those who feel that they had an unfinished business in Tigray because of the Pretoria Agreement would take that opportunity to try and wreak havoc. And this is probably the most serious threat we continue to face. And here, it's one thing to work expeditiously for the return of IDPs, for the implementation of the DDR program, but also I would like to take this opportunity to once again blame the federal government for withdrawing what little military presence it had in the international borders between Ethiopia and Eritrea. That has made it difficult for us to control the borders. And that has given an opportunity for these rogue elements within either the PLF or within the military to use that as a stepping ground for all kinds of nefarious objectives. And if this continues unchecked, the possibility of such a collusion leading to some kind of casus belli for the federal government is going to be quite large. And we don't want that to happen. We don't want the Tigray to become another battleground because either some elements within Tigray and their collaborators from the other side of the border make some stupid decision, and then Tigray will find itself in a very difficult situation. And the best approach for me to protect the people of Tigray from landing in yet another series of conflict is to make sure that the federal government discharges its part of the responsibility, especially in defending, not only protecting the international borders. Of course, it is the responsibility of the federal government to protect the international borders. I'm not inviting the federal government to come in full force and fight. We don't want that to happen. What we want to see is the federal government doing everything in its power to make sure that Tigray is protected against any possible relapse into conflict. The political division within Tigray doesn't require a federal intervention in the sense of presence of forces, but the federal government should be serious about, calling a spade. Those who have made it their business to try and destabilize an interim administration, which also threatens the very Pretoria Agreement itself, holding them responsible when they try and disrupt the conduct of the interim administration, as it has become abundantly clear, is also something I hope would help us in averting yet another crisis. The presence of Eritreans in many parts of Tigray is part of this problem, and it is not Tigray's responsibility, but the federal government's responsibility to call not only for the withdrawal of the Eritrean forces, but also to protect the borders, so that, of course, whatever internal squabbles we'll have will only remain internal. So, in this case, I would also like to call upon international partners who've been supporting the Pretoria process to really not only express their concerns, but also step up to the plate and make their voices heard. I would like to take this opportunity to call on the AU. I know the EU and other US and other countries have put out a statement. Oh, they did? Yeah. He spared me. Okay, thank you. Anyway, I would expect that sort of not just statements, but also enduring attention to what matters here. What we have to do here is to make sure that miscalculations in our part of the region have never been in short supply. So I would call on the international community and the federal government to do whatever in their power to help us avoid miscalculations, whichever direction they might come from. So it's often those miscalculations which have resulted in devastating wars, and the last thing Tigray is ready to entertain is yet another round of devastating war. And of course, any instability in Tigray is going to destabilize Ethiopia, not just Ethiopia, with a very toxic mix of external actors coming into the picture. It is going to further destabilize the region. So one has to once again call on the international community and of course our partners, the federal government, to do everything within their power to help us avoid those miscalculations. Well, the international community's attention should also involve, for example, calling on all the parties within Tigray, those who are disrupting the activities of the interim administration, or those who feel that the international community hasn't done enough to bring us together and to try and at least show us that they really mean business, that there will be consequences to not behaving properly. Whatever those consequences are, of course, can be calibrated on the basis of what sort of behavior is being considered. And of course, basic services, including humanitarian aid for Tigray. I know the federal government has been doing tons of things in terms of restoring basic services, in terms of provision of social services such as education and health. There are a number of areas in light of the enormity of the destruction that was wrought on Tigray. We still have a long way to go. It's very unfortunate. Rehabilitation efforts in Tigray have not been really carried out simply because the last 2 years have been spent on squabbling over internal political matters. But for the international community and for the federal government to once again take the opportunity to try and assure the Tigrayan public that they will continue to have access to those basic services. And of course, we still have hundreds of thousands of millions of people depending on food aid, with of course the lack of resources. The problem has become even more acute at this point in time. So once again, not just basic services, but also humanitarian aid and other factors should also be things that we should consider. And of course, the international community and the federal government clearly supports the interim administration, but with the mandate of the interim administration, at least legally speaking, coming to a close very soon, the federal government needs to find a way to make sure that the interim administration, in fact, gets a new lease on life. But if that's going to happen, we have to also make sure that it is given all the means at its disposal to expedite the process of implementation of Pretoria, and of course, until the conduct of free and fair elections. I don't exactly know when those elections are going to be held, but then the focus should be the fullest possible implementation of Pretoria. But final remark I have to say, I would like to reiterate, at this point in time, the situation on the ground in Tigray is characterized by some people, not every officer, some politicians, not every politician, trying to take advantage of the lawlessness, especially in the northern part of the region, to try and work with external actors to destabilize not only the federal government and also the region. And that will definitely have a potential to make Tigray a battleground, and that is the last thing the people of Tigray expect to see. So we call on the international community and the federal government to do everything within their power to avoid a relapse into yet another conflict. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.